So, you right?
Yep.
Coming at this question again, and this is again somewhat tentative because I don't know of anyone else who's grappling with these questions in quite this way. As I indicated before, I tend to come at this from a toolkit perspective, tools versus models. So we've had, various models, and we're sort of expected to pick up and buy, PFI or alliance contracting or mutuals or social impact bonds or whatever. And I've always been much more interested in tools. What are the particular tools that one might use to solve the problem in front of me, and how do they work? How can I bring them together? And academics haven't helped. Oliver Williamson got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 for a number of things, but particularly for his work on asset specificity. And he mostly looked at specialised physical assets. So if you wind up privatising a unique physical asset that can only, that asset is the only one that can be used for that particular purpose, and that belongs now to somebody in the private sector, you can't have another competition. You're stuck. That can apply with human assets in public services. You wind up with unique human assets and you've got to avoid them being specifically owned. So there is a lack of contestability due to asset specificity. It's an important insight, it's just not a very big one. Williamson does some good writing, most of it fairly academic. And then this guy, I got the Nobel Prize, shared it last year. He's British, although he spent all of his career in America, and I was dreading the day he got it because he got it for the stunning insight that it's difficult to contract things when you can't specify clearly what it is you want. That's what you get a Nobel Prize for these days, apparently. Thank you, Oliver. And unfortunately for Oliver, he studied American prison contracts as his example of this, and the problems he theorised with lots of algebra that existed with prison contracting had actually been solved in the UK and Australia decades ago. So it's sort of annoying to me. They're fair enough points. Now the trouble with that is that you now got other academics doing really seriously important studies and using that hammer and that monkey wrench to try to work on a watch. So this is a really potentially interesting book on the US Coast Guard's deepwater contract. It's what is called a system of systems contract, which Stephen, you're probably familiar with, system of systems contracting. The American Defense Department has actually done quite a bit of it, and there's some pretty impressive system of systems contract. This one looked like it was good. It was the Coast Guard, and it turned out to be a disaster. And they had wonderful access to everybody to study it, and they used Hart and Williamson's insights. That's it. Nothing else. They start off with Hart and Williamson, and shock, horror, they arrive at the end and with Hart and Williamson. Rules and relationship approaches are more likely to work when acquiring a simple product like paper clips. Well, thank you for that. That was, you spent all that time and you had all that access, and that was the best you could give us. I mean, it's slightly better than that, but I promise you, only slightly better. Now, this guy got the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, Robert Thaler, who got it for nudge. And behavioural economics, as it's called, studies the effects of psychological, social, cognitive and emotional factors on the economic decisions of individuals and institutions. That's more interesting. The contribution isn't huge, but it's still more interesting, and the reason he got it is that most economists think that we're all just rational self-maximising machines, and Thaler and some of his colleagues did some really interesting work to point out that we aren't like that at all. Unfortunately, Richard Thaler didn't do any work on contracting, but a couple of decades before this guy had. Now, I need to explain to you about Ian McNeill. He is the father of what's called relational contracting, And this is sort of a typical of Ian's work. Contracting between totally isolated utility maximising individuals is not contract but war. The thing I like about Ian McNeill, he is an American. They are from the Clan McNeill, and his father was wealthy, and the Clan McNeill ran into money problems, and he bought out the family, the clan estates, and became the clan chief in Scotland. And when his father died in 1970, he moved up there and spent the final years of his life in Scotland as the clan chief. And rather than selling off parts of the estate, he sort of leased them to Heritage Scotland for a bottle of whisky a year, which is typical of McNeill. And McNeill is making the point that contracts are socially nested. They nest within a social situation, and that there are social and human relational dimensions to certain kinds of contracts. Obviously, if you buy paper clips, you don't need any relationships to buy paper clips. That's a contract. But you need to really smile at the person at the checkout desk, and that's the limit of the relationships required of you. But lots of other things are more complex, and we'll come back on a little bit of that. So Ian McNeill, while I think he focused too much on the history of some of this stuff and at a theoretical level and not enough at the applied end, McNeill, I think, offers some really important tools to begin to open this stuff up. The other guy, and the guy who had a much more of an impact on me, but very early in my career while I was at law school, is Stuart Macaulay, who really begins the work on relational contracting, although he didn't call it that before McNeill did. I don't know whether there's something about the Scots being involved in doing all this work. McNeill, as a young man, was at the University, I think of Michigan in the Midwest anyway, and was a law professor who went out and spoke to people in local industry, and I think it was mostly the automotive industry, and said, how do you use contracting? And their response was, well, not like you people think. And he wrote an essay in 1963 where he called it a preliminary discourse or something, where he talked about the way in which real people in business actually use contracts. He never really followed up on it, in my view, to the extent that I wish he had. But he finishes that essay by saying, to understand contracting, the whole system of exchange must be explored, different types of business communities must be studied, and contract litigation must be analysed. To translate what I think he was saying, he said, if we want to understand contracts, we must study them in their social context. Look at them in a social setting and how they interface with and work in and out of human relationships. We must compare similar contracts in different contexts, because that's how you observe how these things interact with their environment and why certain things work in some contexts but don't work in others. And we must study contractual relationships when they're under stress. That's never been done. I guess that for me is the challenge, or what's missing, what we need to set about to do.
I'm just wondering if that's quite noisy competing your speaking.
Can we? Can you see if you can turn it off? Thanks.
A series of confusing remote controls today, Gary. Sorry. Nice and engineering.
There we go. And we're probably cool enough now. I want to talk about this explore this along 4 tension lines. Transactional versus relational, continuity versus discontinuity, integration versus fragmentation, specification versus innovation. I think there are probably others, but these are the ones that have struck me in my work on this so far. Quickly on the transactional versus relational, there's, as I said, a difference between contracting for that and contracting for that. And we have not really, there's a little bit of a literature on in the UK on relational contracting in local government. It's okay, it's not offering any great depth. But we clearly need what you do in a contractual environment and a contractual model and a procurement process for that is going to be very different from that. And we need to understand and unpack that, and obviously most stuff will fall, a lot of stuff is going to fall in between. And I think what we find is that it's usually not or. It's usually a mixture. We're using some of both as we try to do this. So, when on the procurement side, there has been too much assumption that we could do. I'm aware of correctional service contracts that at one point that were being awarded through a reverse internet auction. And in fact, when I began researching that report, not another paperclip, I spoke to a very experienced bid manager on the private sector side, and he said he had told their people they were not going to bid for a particular contract which was going to be done by, it was a complex service and it was going to be done by a reverse internet auction. And he said, I said to them, explain to me why that is going to wind up with a happy outcome. That is going to be a price about bid, and it's for a complex service. We need to be looking at it. In my earlier terms, this ought to be more about matching. Explain to me why that's likely to be a good outcome, and they walked away. Now, there was a time when the companies weren't doing that. So the classic, that is literally an auction for flowers, that kind of a process with a clock placing you under artificial pressure is utterly different from that kind of a process where you are eyeballing this person and sorting out not just what are this person's capabilities, but what's their fit. Now this is McNeil's contracting norms, which would need, you'd need to do the reading. But if you just look through some of that sort of stuff, some of what he's put there, you can see that he's talking in a language that's quite different from the language that we often speak of in public service contracting. And that example that I was being told about briefly on Friday of taking 6 months to build trust. Part of what they were reassuring them that they, in the court, this is about a procurement, reassuring them that they would not be leaking valuable intellectual property, but where there was useful intellectual property from the competing bidders that they wanted to share, they would buy it, they would pay for it. I mean, this is stuff that we used to talk about theoretically, and you saw occasionally. It's been very rare in recent years, and it's turned out spectacularly well. Very clever. It was a very complex procurement. It was essentially around design. The tricky bit was around design. But you're talking about human dimensions and two organisations that have different ownership, different missions, needing to work with each other closely on an ongoing basis on shared objective, hopefully shared objectives. And McNeil is touching, seems to me, touching on the kinds of things we need to reflect upon as you would begin to construct a successful partnership going forward.
By the way, they apply very strongly to all the work that's being done, certainly at local authority level, in terms of, quote, renegotiating the relationship between the citizen and the state. If you look down that list, I think that's a brilliant list which provides a practical guide to actually do that.
So McNeil's stuff is quite theoretical, so whether you want to dip into that, you can dip into it without too much effort, but whether or not you want to dip into it. But it's useful to begin. I think this is an area where there is just a lot of work really needs to be done to unpack it and unfold it as it relates to public service contracting. Continuity versus discontinuity. One of the things that competition and contracting does is that it introduces discontinuity into a service. Why and when is discontinuity a good thing is one of those really, really interesting questions that I don't think we pause to reflect on. Let me just quickly see whether No, I didn't. Well, in some circumstances, continuity must also be preserved. So why and when does that matter? That bid team in prisons, that procurement was about profound discontinuity. They were being forced because we were asking them to do very different things to what that prison had traditionally done. And they had to compete with the very real risk that they would not win against the private sector to produce the most efficient solution to that set of specifications. That required them to radically rethink the way they had traditionally done things. A lot of incumbents, there's a little bit of study out of the Department of Defence in America a couple of decades ago. In one of the studies they asked the question, why does the incumbent not win more often when you have an in-house bid? And the reason why the incumbent has trouble is that they have trouble with discontinuity. They have trouble stopping, thinking about how they'd always done it, and thinking about it in a completely fresh way. That's a really challenging thing to do. So there's this, but in other places we want continuity. So where? Well, in some places it's business continuity. You've got customers and you need to have business flow on as normal. Sometimes it's corporate memory. There is just simply a lot of embedded knowledge within the people of an organisation, and you don't want to disrupt that. It would be profoundly damaging to the organisation and its service to disrupt that corporate memory. Sometimes it's specialised human assets. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the National Physical Laboratory, which is the metrology lab for the UK, which was contracted for 2 decades. And that's managing 300 or 400 of the UK's top scientists. These are special people. You better not upset them and watch them all go to France or somewhere to do their research. And you don't want them being owned by the private sector. So you've got this really interesting challenge about a group of really special people, unique people. And then finally, client relationships. One of the places where I've had discussions about this in Australia is where in social care they're looking at trying to have some kind of contracting at least, but perhaps contestability. But the dilemma is I've got caseworkers and social workers who work with vulnerable people. I don't want to be disrupting that every 5 to 7 years when I mean, you may want to disrupt it because the person isn't the right person to do the job, but you don't want to disrupt it because you're having a competition. So how do you design a solution that has discontinuity at a management level but continuity at a caseworker level? And so there's this, it's not either or. You're looking at you're looking at sort of optimising the mix. And so here's just some examples. Sydney Ferries was franchised just around the time I returned to Australia, 2011-12, under a really simple solution because they had key staff. They had the ferry operators and the drivers and the pilots. They needed to keep because they have knowledge of the harbour and how it functions, and that was just simply done through contracts. TUPE in this country works as a continuity tool. It's one of the reasons why TUPE is actually really useful and important in policy intervention. The retention of employment and or secondment model was probably done by Labor, I think, for political reasons, but there's certain places where it's been a really useful tool for addressing the continuity question. Public-private joint ventures with asset leasing and secondment. So the example here is GSTS Pathology, Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And so it was the assets were, it was a true joint venture between Guy's and St Thomas's and a private company, and they added later another public hospital to the three-way joint venture. And they leased the physical assets and they seconded the staff, they didn't transfer them. And so you were able to have continuity then with an element of threat and competition. The GOCO model, government-owned contractor-operated model, come back on that in a minute. GOCO, government-owned contractor-operated, sounds like outsourcing, but it's in fact, it was a model that in its early years had lots of continuity in it because you were doing long-term theoretical research. And then in the UK, when that was introduced here in the 90s, it was combined with TUPE and with NPL created a really interesting model, and then service integrators. So some examples. With the GOCO, Los Alamos, which is where the Manhattan Project was done, and Sandia, which was sort of the next one. These are these sort of iconic energy and defence laboratories in America, and they've never been operated by government. They were always done through contract under GOCO. The DOE laboratories have had 60 researchers affiliated with them that have got Nobel Prizes, and they have discovered 17 new elements in the periodic table. Rather important stuff. And the GOCO model was important for stabilising that and keeping it. Now they introduced more, it was originally that was with the universities, and they introduced private players, and the model has become more of a sort of a cost plus contracting model in recent years, with the result that they're having some problems around continuity. So while they're still called GOCOs, they've sort of surrendered some elements, really important elements of the old GOCO model and I'm going to be over there early next year and middle of next year, and hopefully studying particularly Los Alamos and how it's gone in practice. In the UK, this was picked up for the Atomic Weapons Establishment and for the National Physical Laboratory in the 90s. This is at the National Physical Laboratory. I like to show these because they're fun. This is the old Admiralty tank, one of the two Admiralty tanks at National Physical Laboratory. This is where I saw that before. They've been pulled down now. I saw them before they were pulled down. This is where Barnes-Wallis tested the bouncing bomb as a concept originally. And Newton's apple tree, when it started to decay, they took cuttings, and this is one of the three places where they put it. Kew here and back at the original estate. And that's an apple from Newton's apple tree, which turned out to have very few seeds in it, unfortunately, but I did keep the few seeds that were there. And this guy did his work there. His work on Alan Turing, he did his work on massive computing at the National Physical Laboratory. So that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about an iconic institution, and the question is, this is it today, the question is, how do you do that? Well, they did it really simply by setting up a thing called National NPL Management Limited, which was a company. Government had a golden share. The winning contractor owned the shares in it, and if there was a competition and they lost, they would just simply hand over the shares. The staff were all employed, the scientists were all employed by NPL Management Limited, and if there was a change of contractor, then all that happened was there was just a change in a thin layer of management, and they kept being employed by NPL Management Limited. Life just went on. I mean, really a stunningly simple model that guaranteed the continuity of what you needed here, which was these really, really, really important scientists. And a public-private joint venture at Guy's and St Thomas, as I said, that was dealt with through secondment. The staff were seconded, not transferred to the joint venture, and so that retained leverage on the part of Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, but it also meant that you had staff who could perpetuate their link to the NHS, and that was not being profoundly disrupted. And then finally, the public service integrators is another way of solving it. This is a really interesting one that I studied a couple of years back in the welfare to work area. And Serco and G4S both used this model where they were just really integrators. They did not deliver any services themselves. They assembled a supply chain. In this case, Serco had 4 counties. They constructed a supply chain, so engage, enable, empower, and then they had some specialised services around blindness and things like that. They recruited from the existing provider market in these, and I've just given this one box here would have 2 or 3 people in it, and it's a mixture of public, private, and not-for-profit providers. That's an Australian public provider, private provider. Shaw Trust, of course, is a big UK not-for-profit. Stoke-on-Trent Council. So it's a mixture of providers. They assembled the supply chain. They designed a management information system, a phenomenally detailed management information system, and they sort of had management consultants who could go in and support and assist. And they managed that. Now, the interesting thing about that, when I spoke to the guy who designed this inside DWP, Alan Cave, I said, Alan, is this Serco here, are they the head of a virtual organisation, or are they managing your supply chain? And that's, I think, a plausible argument. Now, that model then has become the sort of model I talk about when I discuss in the social care space in Australia. If basically what you do is just contract for the integrator, then you can have continuity in your supply chain. I mean, you will want to adjust that supply chain over time, although there's not been, on any of the company's part, they've not lost too many of these people because they're quite valuable. These people have local domain knowledge. So you can have competition in the integrator whilst and they manage the supply chain on behalf of government. So again, you're able to have contestability at one level and continuity at another. So that sort of, I just sort of offer that as a sort of a suite of examples of ways in which different ways you can solve this tension between continuity and discontinuity.
I'll just ask a question on that, not just for you, but for people in the room as well. In terms of what's legally possible under procurement regulations, if you go out to, say you go out to tender for sort of the management layer, then can you dictate to them who they work with?
I can't see why you couldn't write a contract that said that. In this case, they didn't dictate that. I mean, this actually happened by accident. Serco and G4S were the only two that chose this model. They chose it because they were both influenced by people who'd worked together in a previous provider, so there was a human reason why they did it. A number of the other providers were also competing in the supply chain, which caused a problem when the workflow was not as strong. There was suspicion on the part of these people's part that these people were handing work down here to themselves. This one didn't suffer from that problem. We have this model a bit in Australia where so we have it in sort of a young youth support program. Although I think in that case they were assembling a supply chain on behalf of government. But there's no reason why, particularly. Yeah, look, I can't see any reason why. It just requires you to work through that model and take it further. Now, they talked about doing it. I don't know that it's ever happened. But the integrator model, in principle, I can't see why you can't contract for an integrator.
There's also the acknowledgement piece of the risk piece, because obviously you're taking back on risk if you're dictating who the supply chain will be. Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, depends what it is. Here on this scenario where we have ended up in that scenario by accident rather than having set out to.
So we have, I don't know whether I come back at it in this presentation, but we have another one in Australia in road maintenance and management, which is a model we borrowed from here. And in fact, the companies that won the two big contracts in Sydney for this were a joint venture between British companies and Australian companies, large companies. And for political reasons, I spoke to the guys who did it, and it was done for political reasons. They said you're not allowed to cannibalise the supply chain. You're not allowed to come in and take over the small to medium enterprises, some of them moderately large, but you're not allowed to come. Now that was done for political reasons. It's actually, I think, a really clever thing to do, because you get to the end of the 7 or 10, it's a 7+3, and if they've taken over the supply chain, the contracts aren't contestable. But if all they are is an integrator, you can actually conceivably replace the integrator in a way that you couldn't if in fact they were one big organisation owning the whole supply chain.
But you can be creative with your procurement as well, because the question we had when we did something similar was that you wouldn't have an open and transparent procurement process if you're dictating who's successful. What we did was the Royal Opera House based in Thurrock, and we wanted them to deliver cultural entitlement to schools. The Royal Opera House is best in terms of the specialisation of dance and theatre and art that we required to deliver. So we couldn't necessarily say we're going to take this ballet company. We wouldn't be able to dictate that. So what we did then was we had a grant whereby the contract was actually the Royal Opera House. Then the schools that were being delivered to a third council put money into a pot. So it was just a different way of doing it to end up with a contract, but we pay them a grant to deliver. They can then have a procurement process where they select those providers, and it works out. We have a cultural entitlement program.
Anyway, we're not here to solve them, but just simply to illustrate. So the integration versus fragmentation. Part of what's going on here is, I mean, we are doing both separation and integration at the same time, and this goes right back to the roots of commissioning. And this, Charlie Ledbetter wrote the book on joined up government, or the little pamphlet on joined up government about 2000. But there was the realisation that you could do joined up commissioning without necessarily having to do joined up delivery. That was, I think, one of the big breakthroughs early on. So the sort of origins of commissioning, I think, go back to two sort of bodies of thought in the 80s. One is Robin Ibb's work in the Next Steps report, the executive agency stuff, which was about separation of executive functions from delivery functions. And so that is about sort of this vertical separation and the professionalisation of executive management within government. The other theme that is running at the same time sort of kicks off with Norman Fowler, who was local government minister in '84, and then Sir Roy Griffith in his report on social, it was responding to an audit office report, talked about the idea of the enabling authority. Now, I was really interested to go back and look at this history because I had not heard of this report from Australia and the enabling authority. I had heard all about the enabling state. Well, that wasn't what Griffiths was talking about. He wasn't rolling out some ideology. He was just simply saying, instead of local authorities obsessing about the little bit of the social care system they personally deliver, someone somewhere has got to be thinking about making this system sensible, accessible by the public, by the service user. And so that's where the idea in the enabling authority came from. And so this is the idea of integration at the commissioning side. Let's integrate not all of that. We don't have to mash together all of the services, but we need a system that integrates the way in which the public access these variety of different health and social care services. So you're doing both. You're just doing by sort of separating commissioning and provisioning and supply in our head. We open up a way of getting both integration and separation going at the same time. So devolution and integration, both of those going on at the same time. I'm one of the differences about the work I tend to do on this, some of my colleagues have been pointing out, is this focus on distinct service units or firms. This is where you can bring together accountability and authority. I have a huge interest in the managers of the frontline firms, who I just think are hugely important in this process. But at the same time, you do have to, those people have got to work within a system and they have got to be accountable for the services that they deliver. Then loose and tight coupling. Is this a concept familiar with? Okay, so it emerges in the 73. It's first written about, but Carl Weick, who wrote not long after the concept emerged, made the point that coupled events are interconnected. Otherwise they wouldn't be coupled, but that each event usually preserves its own identity and some evidence of its own physical or logical separateness. So some things are very closely coupled or tightly coupled. A production line is tightly coupled. If you don't get this bit right, then that bit just down there becomes really, really problematic. And that's where you've got to invest quite heavily in expensive management overheads to make sure that it's tightly coupled, it's got to work. Other things like teaching and consulting are not tightly coupled. They're loosely coupled. They retain identity. And the connections will be at a local interpersonal level rather than at a mega level. And so this is where employee ownership or public service mutuals, this is the first public service mutual, in spite of Cameron and Maud being present, it actually kicked off under Labor. It's a group of community nurses in Surrey, which has been really successful. The coupling is all down there. It's not. They don't have to be tightly coupled up into the NHS trust. And interestingly, Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which is another community nursing model, has been written about a reasonable amount. Again, there's something about the nature of those services that means that the coupling here is tight, but that the coupling up to the rest of the system is and can be much looser, and therefore you can allow this kind of sort of semi-autonomous collective to be functioning rather than having to have things tightly linked up into the rest of the organisation. And then unbundling and rebundling is another sort of dimension of this, and so we're doing both here. Just to take this particular example of unbundling, this is some work again that I did within the New South Wales public hospital system, and just looking at commissioning approach to this. But look at the supply of hospital linen. The sort of tendency is to think that you would outsource the lot, or that was the sort of conversation that used to go on. But it's a somewhat more sophisticated analysis says there's actually a number of different elements to this. So somebody needs to own the linen. You've got somebody who's got to be responsible for continuity of supply. You've got the retail operation, which is requisitions, billings and so on. Somebody's got to operate the laundry. You've then got the transportation of that, and then you've got the distribution of it within the hospital. And you begin to unbundle that, and bits of that need to be close to the hospital or close to government. Other bits of it, laundry operation, doesn't particularly matter who operates the laundry. So parts of this lead us to, we sort of unbundle it in that way, and you can recombine things differently. Most consulting houses have a version of this sort of unbundling side. The interesting side is the rebundling, and I use this example from Denmark, a really interesting company called Falck, who do their fire and emergency services. Falck run 80% of ambulance services in Denmark and 60% of fire services, emergency fire services, and they have done since the 1920s. And if you ask the Danes about whether Falck is public or private, they go,
And they do it without an annual budget process as well. They're one of the beyond budgeting exemplars, I think.
They negotiate contractual arrangements though with the county associations, but yeah.
They don't run to annualised budgets.
So they do the fire and emergency services, the stuff you'd expect, but what's interesting is they have bundled services unlike any other emergency service provider in the world. They also do roadside rescue. We sort of have that with AA or whoever in this country. They do ocean rescue. So when they've had huge storms, Falck has actually been out there coordinating the ocean rescue and the land, the rescue on the land, and the supply of ambulance services and so on. They also do services for sort of non-emergency patient transportation and home care services. And their slogan is "Öde alltid," always there. They have wanted to create a place where, when you thought about the possibility of an accident or a breakdown or whatever, you thought Falck. And in fact, I had lunch, had a dinner I went over and spoke at a function they had organised in the Parliament, and they took a few of us to lunch, and the husband or partner of one of the other academics who was there lived in Copenhagen, and said that Falck had lost a contract to a German company, and he said, I immediately thought, who's going to look after me if I fall down the stairs? I mean, they had got themselves so much into, we're just there to look, to attend to you, that he had trouble contemplating what would happen. And then they do the industrial side of it. So they are combining and finding economies of scale and scope in a way that no fire and emergency services providers anywhere else in the industrialised world do. They have bundled things in a radically different way, and it's that I use it to sort of, to stretch. There's a whole lot of things they don't do that perhaps a traditional government-owned fire and emergency services provider would, or emergency service provider would. They have chosen to bundle in a quite fresh and different way, and the model's quite old. Finally, specification versus innovation. There's just a trade-off here. Body hire contracts where you're just simply paying for a bum on a seat. The Department of Defence in the US does a lot of those. It's actually just to get around congressional staff ceilings, and seems to me to be quite counterproductive. But there's a place for body hire contracts, and then you go through a sort of a hierarchy of inputs, outputs, outcomes, and use a choice. And I use this example of taxis versus buses, because buses are commissioned in the sense that they operate according to a route, a predictable route. And you could have them provided by, that's provided by Arriva. It's possible to have it provided, but they will be provided under a very traditional model, a franchise. Taxis are quite different. They, I buy them myself personally according to my need. These people are now shaking that up. We've got a very different model that is challenging at the bottom end, but in New South Wales I'm advising the Department of Transport on-demand transport, which actually falls in between and are going to challenge both ends of this. So this is where they don't have a route, they don't have a timetable. I can ring it up and book them. I'll have to walk a bit to a place that sort of suits a group of us. They won't drop me at my home, but they're going to be, they're going to be quite much more flexible. And if the train's delayed, we can communicate, and I know that there'll be a minibus or whatever there. Much more fluid, flexible, and it creates real problems at both ends, both for the taxi owner who's got a piece of property, as it were, a plate, and the bus who's got a route and a franchise. And we're now moving into really challenging spaces, because innovation is challenging the need for specification, and that tension's always been there. How much can I specify and be certain, and how much do I in fact want to encourage people to do things differently? In this space, technology has enabled that disruption, and we're seeing emerge, communications technologies, we're seeing emerge a whole new service that is going to really push at the comfortable boundaries that we had drawn between those two. A lot of this, it seems to me, is about flexibility, and it's about flexibility for whom. Commission services, the commissioner commissions a service from a provider, and with a body hire contract, the discretion lies with the commissioner. It is a contract, but I have a lot of discretion about what that person does and when they do it. Only slightly different from a contract of employment. And then right down the other end, we have outcome-based contracts, which has been a lot of interest in recent years, and there's a lot more flexibility, and discretion lies with the provider. We provide a broad envelope within which they deliver the service, but they have lots of discretion, lots of flexibility in how they provide it. Voucher services fall down that continuum. They don't have a commissioning dimension to them, although, as I said earlier, they may contain some of it. But essentially, these are services funded through a voucher. In that sense, they're commissioned. Somebody says, this is the envelope within which you can spend this voucher. But a lot of discretion lies with the customer. The customer gets to choose who their provider will be. And then the third side of that are services bought in the open market, where government may regulate, but essentially the relationship is between customer and provider, and they're spending their own money. So a lot of that question of certainty versus flexibility is a question of who do we want to have the flexibility. It's about being much more flexible about how we approach that question. So I sort of put those tension lines up to sort of make the point that we're often having to trade off some mix of these particular elements. Continuity, discontinuity. Discontinuity can be a really good thing, but for certain purposes it can be a bad thing. I actually want continuity. So what tools have I got? What tools can I work with in order to give myself a mix of those that suits the particular problem I've got in front of me?
Can I suggest, my head is spinning and I've trained hard for this campaign. Perhaps if you could put a list of the different dimensions up and we could split it into small groups to have a conversation about applicability and questions of what we've just taken in for 5-10 minutes. Would that be okay?
Yeah. Does that? What part of this do you think it would benefit from unpacking more?
I'm going to turn off the camera.